Hello, welcome back to RetroBreak. I was just playing the Sonic re-release on the Switch on the Sega Ages collection, and it got me thinking back to when I first experienced the original Sonic the Hedgehog, back when I was about 5 or 6. I grew up as a Nintendo kid, so of course I was very much used to playing platformers like the Mario and Mega Man games, and the Donkey Kong Country games on the SNES, and all sorts of great stuff like that. So when my parents came home one day with a Sega Megadrive, I was very excited because I'd heard of a game called Sonic the Hedgehog, which apparently was the fastest game ever released. It blew everyone's minds, it was way better than Mario, so of course I was very excited, got it all hooked up, finally sat down to play Sonic the Hedgehog, and I was greeted by this. I was a little bit confused at first. It didn't seem quite as fast as I was expecting it to be. I'd seen some adverts on TV and I'm sure it was supposed to be faster than this. I mean, even playing through the original Mario on the NES it seemed faster. It wasn't actually until many years later, when the Gamecube came out and Sonic Mega Collection came out for it, that I finally realised that all these years I'd been playing an inferior version of the game. I'd actually been playing the PAL version of the game, which plays about 20% slower than the actual American version of the game, which is the version that most people around the world got to play. Of course, because Sonic didn't quite live up to my expectations as a kid, I went out to find some other Mega Drive platformers that could hopefully fill the void on that system, because at the time platformers were by far my favourite style of game. So I've come up with a list of 6 of my favourite games that aren't Sonic the Hedgehog. Enjoy!
Are you ready? Yeah!
One of the very first games that I remember playing on the Mega Drive that wasn't Sonic is a game called Gladiators. It's an original IP loosely based around the McDonald's company. It is a very loose connection though, mostly just shown by M letters that you collect throughout the stage, and a really creepy dancing Ronald McDonald at the end. The game was made by Virgin Interactive, the same studio that brought games like Aladdin and Lion King to the Mega Drive. Gladiators actually uses the same engine as those games, so you know that everything's going to feel really nice and responsive. And best of all, being a UK studio, it doesn't suffer the same fate as the original Sonic the Hedgehog, because this game was made for 50Hz consoles. It's a really fast and fun game with plenty of hidden areas and big levels to explore. I'm not actually very good at the game though. In fact, in all these years I've never actually got past level 3, but it's a game that I have really fond memories of, and it's one that I come back to time and time again, and I can enjoy it every time I put it in, even all these years later. Even playing the game for this video though, I really struggled to get anywhere in it. But the main thing is, I had a good time doing so, and I'm sure you will as well if you decide to check it out. Before I move on to the next game, I just want to show you how much effort I put into recording these games using the original system that I had as a kid. As you can see, it's a mess of wires. I had the SCART cable going into the OSSC, which then goes into a SCART to HDMI upscaler, which then goes into a SCART splitter, because my capture card couldn't recognise either of the signals. It took me a long time to figure out, so I really hope you appreciate all the effort that I put into making this video possible. Now, on to the next game. So the second game we're looking at here is Kid Chameleon. It was made by Sega Technical Institute, a division of Sega of America which was founded by the gaming legend Mark Cerny. He's an incredibly important man in the history of gaming, and I hope to make a full episode about him in the future, but for now back to the topic at hand. Kid Chameleon is a pretty standard platformer, and it's certainly a lot easier than Gladiators. The story goes that there's a new arcade machine that's just opened up, and it lets kids go inside and experience a world of virtual reality. I really love this concept for the game because it opens the levels up to a lot of interesting possibilities. There's also a lot of interest in power-ups. Because they're so random, they kind of fit because of the story, whereas in another game they may feel a little bit out of place. Unfortunately, the controls do feel a little floaty and slippery, especially coming from something like the Mario series. The level layouts as well aren't quite as well thought out, but even with all those negatives, there's something about the game that always draws me back in. It's quite funny actually, the first time I ever played Kid Chameleon wasn't actually on the Megadrive. The first time I played it was on the Gizmondo, back in college, when I thought the Gizmondo was one of the best systems around. I had my Gizmondo loaded up with a Megadrive emulator and I played hundreds of Megadrive games, and that's pretty much how I found out about the majority of the Megadrive's library. But that's for another episode as well. So although it's not one of the best platformers ever, I definitely recommend giving it a try. It's fairly simple, so it's quite easy to get quite far into the game, and it is quite an enjoyable experience. Now we're getting into the really interesting games. This one is Dynamite Headdy, made by the critically acclaimed development studio Treasure. This was the second game that they made for the Mega Drive after the fantastic Gunstar Heroes. And this game is just as good as that, but it's quite different in a lot of ways, so I'm going to get into a few of them now. For one, it's a lot more slower paced than Gunstar Heroes, but it's packed full of really interesting and unique ideas. Basically, the whole game is set up like a stage show. Throughout each level, you can find different upgrades that actually change your head. Kind of like how Rayman changes his fists, you can throw your head forwards and attack the enemies or grab onto ledges. There's loads of different ways that they think about using this gimmick in the game, and it just plays really, really well. The graphics are really bright and colourful, everything that you'd expect from a Treasure game. The music is fantastic, the level design is great, the characters, the animation, everything about this game I love. I really, really do. It's definitely one of the most unique platformers of all time. Unfortunately, the game does have quite a sharp difficulty spike towards the second half of the game, but after a lot of practice, it is quite easy to get all the way through, and it's a game that I would highly recommend getting. And unlike the other two games that I've covered so far, this one is actually available in the Sega Genesis collection that's out on the Switch, the PS4 and the Xbox One, so there's no excuse not to play this one. Fantastic game, 100% recommend it. I'm sure all the Sega fans watching already know what game this is. Of course, it's Ristar, or Ristar. Apparently, the character Ristar came from one of Yuji Naka's original ideas for Sonic the Hedgehog, a rabbit that grabbed things with its ears. The idea was revisited many years later by Sega, and it took the form of Ristar. There's a really interesting history into how the game was developed, but I'll cover that in more detail in the future. For now though, let me show you why the game is worth playing. The thing I love most about Ristar is its simplicity. Much like the Sonic games that came before it, the whole game revolves around the use of just two buttons: grab and jump. Everything in the game is based around this incredibly simple concept, and it works brilliantly. The levels are all very unique and interesting, the soundtrack is just as good as any of the Sonic games and it fits the theme perfectly. Each area you visit in the game is incredibly unique with its own style, gameplay, enemies, boss fights and gimmicks. If you go into the game expecting something like Sonic though, you're going to be disappointed, but if you go in expecting a slower paced, more methodical and well thought out platformer, then you're bound to love Ristar and its unique playstyle. It's outside the scope of this video, but there was also a really well made port for the Game Gear. So if you have one, or if you're thinking of picking up an Analog Pocket and the Game Gear adapter, I'd say it's definitely worth tracking down both versions of this game. You will not be disappointed. Rocket Knight Adventures was one of the most important games for me growing up. I was given it as a surprise by my uncle who had picked up a lot of Mega Drive games from a boot sale back in the early 2000s. Most of them, of course, were just basic sports games, but Rocket Knight Adventures really stood out to me as something a little bit more interesting. So I put it in the system, and I was immediately blown away by the quality of the game. Here is the game, and if you follow me, there is the Sega Mega Drive.
There's the game going in.
It's one of the reasons why I got into game collecting as much as I did. I've always tried to recreate the feeling that I had that day of playing something completely new for the first time and just being amazed at how good it was. It was also one of the reasons why I started this channel in the first place almost 14 years ago. Okay, this is Nintendo. Welcome to my first ever video playthrough. As I'm sure you know if you've watched The Angry Schmergal Nerd, I'm quite the fan of Rocket Knight Adventures, so I thought that this should be the first game that I play through for you. So, to say the game holds a special place in my collection is a little bit of an understatement. I definitely plan on covering the whole of the Rocket Knight series in a lot more detail in the coming months and years on the channel. But for now, let me give you just a quick overview of why I love this game so much. First of all, the controls. The main character, as you can see, has a jetpack, and having that jetpack opens up so many movement possibilities that wouldn't be possible in other platformers. It quickly made the game feel so much different to a lot of other character-based platformers at the time, which this one was trying to be a part of. The inclusion of a jetpack and a sword makes the game feel so much different to a lot of other character-based platformers that were available at the time. This one really stands on its own as one of the best controlling platformers of the 16-bit era. In Rocket Knight, a lot of thought has clearly been put into how long each stage is, how the levels transition from one to another. It's all been expertly crafted to make the game as fun and fluid as possible, and it really shows. Rocket Knight really was Konami on top form, and I highly recommend it. Now for the final game in this video, and I thought I'd come back on camera for this one because it's a very special game to me. I'm sure you've guessed what it is. Of course, it's the sequel to Rocket Knight Adventures, Sparkster. And the reason I came back on camera to do this one is when I opened up the game to get some gameplay for this episode, I found in here the original receipt. Like I said, when I first got Rocket Knight Adventures, I didn't know what it was. I'd never had any exposure to the series before, but after I found out, of course, I found out about the sequels and I just had to get it. I didn't actually have my own eBay account at the time, so I went to my local game shop called GameZone in Shrewsbury, which unfortunately is closed down these days, but I do have this little memory of them here. I'll try and get a close-up without the light on it. But basically they actually ordered the game in from their stock, from their warehouse online. They had it in one of the other stores and they got it in for me and I managed to get it for £20. I think it's worth a lot more than that these days, so that was a pretty fair price to pay and definitely a great price for the amount of hours of enjoyment that I got from this game. I don't think it's quite as good as Rocket Knight Adventures, but it's definitely up there as one of my best platformers of all time. I absolutely love it. They made some changes to the game that make it even more fun to play than the original. The rocket can now be used multiple times in a row and it actually charges up automatically. It makes the game a little bit more complicated, but I think overall it works extremely well. There was actually another sequel released for the SNES, which I did a video on about 6 years ago now, so the quality of the video might not be great, but I'm sure everything I said in that video still stays true today. So if you're interested in seeing the other Sparkster game, definitely go and check that one out. And I will definitely be making a full episode, like I said, dedicated to the whole Rocket Knight series in the future. Absolutely love all of these games, even the one that was released on the Xbox 360 and PS3, even though it's not quite as good as these. The one thing that lets this game down for me though, compared to the original at least, is the inclusion of more auto-scrolling levels. I really hate auto-scrolling stages. I feel like they just slow the game down so much and they're a little bit unnecessary, but apart from that, I love everything about this game. The music, the graphics, while not quite as good as the original, are still really good. The music I think is better, the gameplay, like I said, I think is better, and just overall it's a fantastic game. It's got loads of style, and it's just a game that I go back to again and again, and I can't get enough of it. So that's why I put Sparkster at the top of this list. I also asked on Twitter the other day what are some of your favourite Megadrive platformers, and I was expecting 1 or 2 responses, but I got loads, so let's quickly have a look through what you guys had to say. So Carl here says that some of his favourites include Dynamite, Headdy, the rest of the Sonic games apart from Sonic 1, Castlevania, Rocket Knight, Castle of Illusion, Aladdin, Strider, and he would have included Gunstar Heroes but thought that it was more of a run and gun than a platformer. And to be honest, that's the only reason that I didn't include Gunstar Heroes as well. Next up here is Rob VGU, and he says Kid Chameleon, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and Ristar. So apart from Sonic, pretty much the same games that I picked for this episode. It'd be really interesting to hear some of the other games that you enjoy, so please leave a comment if you're watching, Rob. Now Leon says Rocket Knight, of course, a fantastic game. Tom Davies also loved Rocket Knight, maybe a little bit more than Sparkster, and to be honest I think the same as that as well. David Fisher says there's so many to choose from, pretty much every Disney game would get a shout out from me, as would all the Sonic games. But Rocket Knight Adventures, Earthworm Jim, that's one that I didn't mention so far, and Strider are 3 that leap out to him. Unfortunately I don't really like Strider as much as a lot of people seem to. Maybe I should go back and give that one another shot at some point in the future. Peebs says Vector Man, Gunstar Heroes and Sparkster. All probably in your list. Well, Gunstar Heroes wasn't because I class it more of a run and gun, and Vector Man, I do enjoy that, but I think it just missed out on this list here. Maybe if I was to do a top 10. Sean here says Super Turrican. I was going to include that, but then if I wasn't including Gunstar Heroes, I figured I shouldn't include Turrican either. Super Nerds UK says Decap Attack is a fantastic platformer, and yes, I agree, I really love that one. There's some more love for Rocket Knight Adventures there from Wavy A. Jewel Knights Jess says she tagged her friend in it, and her friend mentioned Sonic and Ristar, but what about Rocket Knight? I'm loving all the love for Rocket Knight in this chat here, as does Comic Zone count as well. So I'm not sure about Comic Zone, I think that's more of a beat 'em up, but it is a great game. And I know that Slope's Game Room has just done an episode on Comic Zone in particular, so definitely go and check that out if you want some really cool Comic Zone history. He does some really great videos. Steve there says Kid Chameleon, so I'm sure he'll be happy if he's watched this video. Let me know down in the comments if you've seen it, Steve. Hellforge Props says Cool Spot, one of the biggest adverts in gaming. Yep, Cool Spot is a great game, although it's not one that I actually grew up with. It's one that I've picked up more recently when I was trying to add to my Megadrive library. And of course it got a lot of people to drink a lot more 7-Up back in the day. So I guess that's proof that advertising in games does work if it's done right. And Hellforge Props also has another post here. 2 not so common ones that I loved were Green Dog, the beach surfer dude, and unfortunately I cut the other one off there. I've never played Green Dog before, in fact I hadn't even heard of it until this tweet, so if anyone's played Green Dog, let me know what they think of it. Is it worth picking up? Sarah here says she's only really played on the mini model, but Mickey Mouse Castle of Illusion or Ghouls and Ghosts. They're both fantastic games, so don't worry about them not being too interesting. They're definitely worth playing. Retro Prime here says the Megadrive has loads of different platformers, but he enjoyed Tanglewood. That's a game that I really need to get round to playing. I actually backed it on Kickstarter I think, and I've got it here sitting on the shelf, but I haven't gone back to play it yet. Matthew says Alicia Dragoon, and I was actually going to include this one in the video, but at the last minute I swapped it out because I remembered how much I loved Global Gladiators, and I didn't want this video to be too long. Although now it looks like it's coming up to about 20 minutes, so much for not wanting a long video. Dan D had a big list of games here. He also mentioned Green Dog, which was the one that I hadn't heard of before. A few other interesting ones there. Talmit's Adventure, I really like that game. And the Jungle Book as well. And the World of Illusion Mickey Mouse game. The Gaming Contrarian here mentioned a game that I've never heard of before as well, called Maui Mallard in the Cold Shadow. Never heard that one, but apparently he loved it and it gets pretty darn hard later on. And he also tagged his friend Rusty here to say it's up to him to name Bubsy. Believe it or not, I've never played a Bubsy game, so I don't know if they're as bad as people make them out to be or not. Now, Gavin says, aside from the obvious, Zool is a decent platformer. Yeah, that's a pretty fun one. Brian here showing a gif of Vector Man. James Cushin says Aladdin, Sonic 2, Vector Man and Cool Spot. There we go, there's Bubsy, someone said it. Decap Attack again there from the profile picture of do ... Neil Hibbs says Herzog 2. That's an RTS, not a platformer, but it is a great game, so I'll give you a mention anyway. Michael David Gin Wright says Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Pulseman, Mystic Defender, Last Battle, and James says Coolspot was great. Pulseman is one that I wanted to show, but I've only got a repro, so I feel kind of bad showing that when I wanted to kind of give the authentic experience. So there we go, thank you all so much for sending in your tweets. So thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I've got so many plans for YouTube this year. I'm going to continue to work to improve my channel and to improve all the content I produce on it as well. So if you've got any advice or any tips to give me, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. But as always, please comment, subscribe, check out my Patreon and Ko-fi, links are in the description, and I'll see you next week for the next episode. Goodbye.